Hi, my name is Matt McGillis. I'm the Senior Program Manager at Johns Hopkins 21st Century Cities Initiative and the co-author with Matthew Kahn of the new book, Unlocking the Potential of Post-Industrial Cities. In this new webcast series, we explore themes discussed in our book by diving deep into the history and future of the 6 post-industrial cities of Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. We look at the ways in which these cities can improve outcomes for people, neighborhoods, and businesses, and how they can attract new residents and investment so that everyone can reach their full potential. Today, I'm joined by Alec Mcgillis to discuss his new book, Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One-Click America. Alec Mcgillis is a senior reporter for ProPublica and the recipient of the George Polk Award and the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting. Hi, Alec. Thanks for joining me today and congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So in your book, you look at the experience of several cities in the last 50 years, including the contrasting experiences of Seattle, Washington, and Dayton, Ohio. A lot of people may not be familiar with Dayton, Ohio's history as a center of innovation dating back to the 19th century with more patents per capita than any other city in the US. It was something I wasn't aware of. But they're probably more familiar with the struggles of the city today, especially as being one of the centers of the opioid epidemic. We all know about Seattle's experience in recent decades and with its famous billboard telling the last person leaving the city to turn the lights out. What happened and why were cities like Seattle able to grow their economies while other cities like Dayton fell into decline and depopulation? And is this just a story of the success of Microsoft and Amazon and the human capital and companies that clustered around them? Or were there other forces at play?
It is large. I would say it's largely is the story of the way the tech economy works now, that you end up with an agglomeration of wealth and prosperity and dynamism and growth in a handful of cities in a more concentrated way than what we used to see. I think there's a temptation to say, oh well, we've always had cities that were ahead or behind of the curve. Always had richer and poorer places in this country. So what's the big deal really to have now some cities way ahead and some others lagging? But the fact is, the gaps really are just much bigger than they used to be. There's simply a bigger spread now between the sort of winner take all, winner take most cities and the left behind ones. And that it has a lot to do, of course, with the way that the tech economy works. That as the Moretti and all the other sort of place economists will point out, that there's this natural agglomerating tendency where you feel like where it's all about the human capital, where it's all about just being somewhere where all the innovators are together in one place, making their breakthroughs, clustered together with capital, and that's different, of course, than the industrial economy of yore, where once you had an innovation, say the Bessemer steelmaking process, you could go off and use that innovation anywhere where you had the natural resources and the basic manpower and the transportation to get your product to market, and you could just do it just about anywhere. And now, of course, the whole value lies in that initial innovation, the actual sort of manufacturing that spins out from this negligible importance. And so it's all about that human capital. It's all about the clustering and having the proximity for those innovations. What's made it worse is that, or exacerbated that sort of that agglomerating tendency, is the fact that we have gotten so lax about antitrust. So we've allowed you end up with a much smaller group of winner companies, dominant companies, and so the choices that they make about where they happen to be end up having this sort of outsize importance and consequence. So the fact that Microsoft ends up in Seattle simply because that's where Bill Gates and Paul Allen are from. They go to prep school there. They go off to Boston. They end up in Albuquerque, where they actually start the company, and they get sort of kind of bored and homesick in Albuquerque, and also are having some trouble getting people to come work in Albuquerque. Who wants, they have some trouble getting people to come to New Mexico, and so they go back home to Seattle. And And then Amazon, Jeff Bezos has no personal connection to Seattle, but he then comes there a decade later, because Microsoft is already there, and you have that tech talent already there to draw off of. And on top of that, of course, he sees tax advantages to going there as well. So in that sense, it can be as kind of happenstance as that, which wouldn't matter that much, so much of life is happenstance, but because these guys get so huge, it ends up mattering a whole ton. And you end up with, oh my gosh, next thing you know, you've got 45,000, 50,000 Amazon employees in Seattle alone, while yes, all the Daytons and are essentially the warehouse logistics towns that have seen all this commerce that used to sort of just flow naturally through the city and sort of, just a kind of daily kind of basis, increasingly in all these different sectors, kind of sucked away into the Seattles, into the Bay Areas, as those handful of companies come to dominate so much of our daily life and commerce.
And you really talk a lot about these regional disparities and competition between cities in your book, and this is highlighted, most famously by Amazon's HQ2 competition, which ultimately went to cities that were already booming and doing well. In our book, we look at this type of competition and highlight when cities and states compete for sort of the big golden goose and offer these generous tax breaks, it usually ends up in a bad result. And a popular example of this among economists is the $1 billion tax subsidy that Wisconsin gave to Foxconn that resulted in almost nothing for the state.
Yeah.
And this is bad, not only for the places that offer these subsidies, but it's bad for the people that live in these cities, because it also means that local officials are more concerned with luring in sort of the outside big company rather than investing in sort of, growing local businesses and quality of life. So in your mind, what does this type of competition between cities and states tell us about our modern economy?
Oh, it's terrible. And I'm sure you saw that just yesterday. I think Foxconn, came out, that they were further slashing what they were actually going to deliver there in terms of jobs and investment in Wisconsin. I mean, it's a joke, and it's a bad joke. And what you see with Amazon is actually this happening at two very different levels. You had the HQ2 spectacle, which is just extraordinary to watch that happen. Watch 238 cities just thrown into a tizzy and putting all these hours, so many hours and manpower into those bids, and then ending up not only with the two most obvious East Coast cities, winter cities, getting the prize in the end, but even the 20 finalists were so predictable and included basically virtually none of the quote sort of left behind cities. No, not a single Baltimore or St. Louis or Cleveland or Detroit or Milwaukee on that list. The only one that comes close, I guess you'd say, is Newark, but that sort of has an asterisk because it's sort of New York Metro. But then you have the other level of the warehouses and the data centers, and you have this whole this other realm where you have cities and towns and states also throwing all these subsidies at Amazon for those facilities, and in that case, it's all the more kind of head scratching because at least in the case of HQ2, it was such a big whale, it's such a huge prize that you could see, people, it's kind of lottery ticket, why not go ahead and buy that lottery ticket for the Powerball? But for the warehouses and the data centers, it's all the more confounding because in the case of the data centers, of course, there's barely any jobs that come with them, just a few dozen per center. In the case of the warehouses, jobs are famously, difficult and low paying and for many people incredibly sort of transitory. And we can talk about that more, but but what's most confounding about it is that especially with the warehouses, they have to be in certain places. Like once the company has decided to start offering 1 and 2 day delivery to people, it needs to have warehouses just about everywhere, as opposed to the early days when they could avoid being in certain states to kind of keep up the tax avoidance game. They now need to be just about everywhere, and so why is Baltimore offering $43 million in subsidies? Baltimore and Maryland offering $43 million in subsidies for their first warehouse here in the former GM plant on Broning Highway, when they needed to be in Baltimore. This was their first one back in 2014 or so, and yet there they are shelling it out. And it's not as if they can suddenly just declare that they're going to go to West Virginia or Kentucky instead. They need to have that warehouse here, but yet we're throwing the subsidies at them. It's completely perplexing, and I guess there's these efforts now. There's this interstate compact, effort to build an interstate compact to sort of move us beyond that game, but it's been going on for years, and Amazon has in a way perfected the pursuit of just the taking advantage of it. The fact that they have an entire division in their company that is dedicated to this task of getting these subsidies, of winning this race to the bottom, and it's called the Department of Economic Development, which is so incredible and so cynical, and just sort of says it all.
Yep. So in your book, you also mention Ford Motor Company and Upton Sinclair's criticism of their low wage pay. But ultimately, wages improved as workers were able to unionize and fought for pay increases. And part of the reason they were able to do this was because Ford was geographically concentrated in Detroit, so it was to a certain degree beholden to the city and its residents and workers. Now we have Amazon, which is largely decentralized with distribution sites and offices spread across the U.S., as you mentioned, and operating in multiple countries. And while it's headquartered in Seattle, it could, with not too much difficulty, relocate to another city if it wanted to. And this means that Amazon is likely less likely to respond to protests and threats unless they're sort of at a national scale, which are considerably more difficult to organize. So, thinking about this, as more companies become less tied to cities, what does this mean for low-wage workers in the cities where these low-wage jobs are concentrated?
That's an interesting way of thinking about this. I mean, I hadn't really thought of there's so many challenges to organizing at Amazon, as we saw in Alabama. I'm not sure if I would rank this particular factor high in the list. I mean, the fact is that even when the auto organizing got rolling back, in the 30s, it was Detroit loomed very large, but in fact the initial crucial sit-down strikes that came after GM were dispersed. There were 3 crucial ones in like 36 and 37. One was in Flint, one was in Cleveland, and one was in Atlanta. And that's sort of what got the ball rolling at GM, and it got you to the first contract, UAW contract with GM. And then with Amazon, I'm not sure how well the Seattle Detroit analogy works, because of course the crucial thing with Amazon is not going to be organizing the office, the 45,000 professional salaried office workers in Seattle, although you're definitely seeing some ferment. It's kind of activism ferment among high-tech professionals these days, but it is so that's not so much the stake or the question of that group, but it is the warehouses themselves. And also I think of back to the other analogy that I of course spend so much time on in the book, which is the steel industry. In the steel industry, when you finally end up with with steel getting organized in the 30s and early 40s during the war, that was also quite dispersed, right? So you had Gary and Weirton and Baltimore and Chicago, and it was also quite spread across the map. So in that sense, not so dissimilar to what we have with the warehouses. I mean, I think that the main challenge with the warehouses remains, first of all, the incredible transit nature of that work, which makes it so hard to build solidarity and togetherness and common purpose. The fact that you have nearly pretty much 100% turnover, a lot of these warehouses. I mean, think about that every single year, a whole new bunch of faces. The fact that you have the work itself is so isolating and atomizing. Like within the warehouse, you barely get to know each other. You're at your station with your robots, and over, someone else is over there packing the stuff that you're sending down the conveyor belt. But you're really quite alone. You're even more alone now in the pandemic because they've kind of split people up on the floor for spacing. I was speaking on recently about this issue of the isolated nature of the work and how it contrasts with the steel mill of yore, and the fact that you used to roll out of work off your shift at the mill, and you'd often, of course, go out for beers or breakfast or whatever it might be with the other guys. And an Amazon worker actually chimed in, and I was on radio and said, yeah, there's no way I'm going to go out for a beer after work with Joe, because I don't even know who Joe is. Like, he might be 50 feet away and I don't know who he is. So you have that challenge of the transit and isolating nature of the work. Then you just have of course, Amazon's incredible effectiveness at pulling out all the stops and deterring organizing, as you saw in Alabama. And then on top of that, I think there's just it's sort of sad to talk about this, but the diminished expectations of the workforce in a lot of these places where people are, where there's so few options now, that where it really is kind of, working at Amazon for $15 or the fast food job for less than that. And, hey, it's better than nothing. I'm not going to be doing this for that long. I don't plan to build any kind of career around this. I'm just here for the time being, and I'm going to go on to something else. I barely know anyone in my family who belongs to a union, who's gotten sort of higher pay and more stability and more voice in the job through that. It's when you get down to 6% private sector unionization, you almost lose. There's like a critical mass of like familiarity of knowing what a union could even bring you. So I definitely see those as the main challenges to organizing.
Thanks. I want to pick up on some of that in a little bit, but now sort of going from the city level to the neighborhood level and ultimately people. One of the things we look at in our book is challenges that cities face when they experience economic growth and have to deal with gentrification and displacement. Early on in your book, you highlight a vibrant Black neighborhood of the Central District in Seattle. And many people might know that Jimi Hendrix grew up in Seattle, but they might be surprised to learn that there was once a large and several large Black communities in the city that were doing quite well. What happened to those neighborhoods and the people that lived there as Seattle's economy began to take off in the 90s and 2000s?
I mean, what happened is that it's been almost entirely erased. I mean, it's extraordinary to go there and to see. It's the main Black neighborhood is called the Central District, and it's quite central, as its name says. And it grew up, over really going all the way back to the late 19th century. I grew up, through the classic, dynamics of redlining and discriminatory behavior by landlords and realtors, and that was where you were allowed to go. But you had this burgeoning Black community that ended up there, especially during World War II, when you had the shipyards and Boeing and all the rest just needing a lot more manpower. And so Seattle was almost kind of like the last stop on the Great Migration Express, and ended up with this very vital community that was especially known for incredible music scene. You know, so Quincy Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Ernestine Anderson, just an amazing assemblage of people. And then with the growth of Microsoft, and then especially Amazon, it basically didn't stand a chance. It's only a few miles from South Lake Union, the Amazon campus just north of downtown. These lovely kind of, you know, arts and crafts bungalows, and that are now going for $700,000, $800,000, $900,000. And you go there now, and I mean, I was actually confused when I got there. Like, I live in Baltimore, and I know what a Black neighborhood looks like. And you go there and you say, wait, in my head, you know, you have the address, and this in this corner. You go there and you think, wait, this is no, like it's stunning. It is stunning. And there's been these efforts to sort of somehow retain some heritage and somehow retain traces. And I, you know, one day I watched a parade of, there's a annual sort of Black Heritage Festival in the midsummer, and they have a parade that goes through the neighborhood, and it's surreal to watch, you know, these, you know, various sort of high school drill teams and you know, auto clubs and whatnot parading down the street when you have, and then you have literally all the brand new apartment buildings with the almost entirely white residents of the apartment building sitting up there on their balconies, sipping coffee and looking down at the sort of Black Heritage Parade going by them, trying to link back to some kind of past that is barely even present anymore. But so that's what's happened to that neighborhood, and of course it's happening in other cities too. And what I hope the book gets at is something that I feel like is too often missed in the debates about this, in these winner-take-all cities, where you have this constant debate about what should we do about this problem of displacement and housing costs. Should we build more supply, or should we, you know, sort of deal with this through rent control, essentially through regulation? And there's this whole back and forth about this sort of intra-left debate about this, and it can get very kind of vicious. And what it misses is that broader context, which is that you end up with this problem of these extraordinary housing affordability problem in these cities, because you have such incredible concentrated growth and prosperity and wealth there. And that if you had less of that concentration, if our growth and prosperity were dispersed somewhat more across other cities in this country, it wouldn't be so acute a problem in these cities. But the debate within these cities is not linked. The housing debate is not linked to that broader context often enough. And in fact, often when you try to bring this up with you know, people who worry about this problem in these cities, there's often a reluctance to consider this, because there's this feeling that, well, no, we do want all the growth here. We love our city. We want all the growth here. We don't think it should go elsewhere, partly because the growth here would be the greenest kind of growth. You know, to have dense growth in a Seattle or New York or DC is the greenest way for our planet to thrive. When in fact, so many of these other left behind cities that have vast capacity to spare, such as Baltimore, are perfectly dense themselves, could accommodate all sorts of dense green urban growth. And instead you have vast swaths sitting empty. The fact that we now have people, you know, struggling to afford $700,000 or $800,000 or $900,000 row houses in DC, while we're demolishing those same row houses by the hundreds and thousands just 40 miles up the road in Baltimore, is insane. And that suggests that there's something really broken. And I wish that the debate, the affordability debate in those cities, in the winter cities, took into account more how this is all being driven by the concentration of wealth in these places, and how much dispersal of that would actually help.
I agree, and want to pick up on that a bit later. But again, thinking about people living in these cities, cities that saw a decline. In William Julius Wilson's 1996 book, When Work Disappears, he highlights the impact that job loss had on people in communities beyond the loss of a salary. And in your book, you look at the changing nature of work for a large section of America's workforce. And you do a great job of highlighting these changes among different generations in the same family. So again, looking beyond the workplace and sort of generally speaking, what are the different life course impacts of somebody who could graduate high school and go to work at Bethlehem Steel and work there their entire life versus getting out of high school and going into an Amazon warehouse in Baltimore or another similar cities, and thinking about what does this mean for intergenerational economic mobility and sort of the achieving the American dream.
No, the impact is huge, and I think the best example of that in the book is probably actually in Dayton. This young man who, the name of Todd Swallows, who grew up in the Dayton area, and his father ran a small trucking company, was a successful guy who had built this trucking company with about 10 or 12 trucks delivering auto parts up and down that corridor, the I-75 corridor, that running basically from Dayton up to Detroit and Flint. Dayton was a huge auto parts manufacturing town, basically the second biggest auto manufacturing town after Detroit. And he was part of that sort of supply chain, and they lived in a nice little sort of a gated community, very kind of modest gated community in a town outside of Dayton, and a very kind of middle class upbringing. But then in the around 2006 or so, as we're heading into toward the Great Recession, you start having just massive job losses in the auto manufacturing sector in Southwest Ohio. Just one plant after another shutting down, and Todd Swallow's dad's company goes bankrupt. Just that supply chain just breaks down, and this is of course not happening in a void. This is happening after both NAFTA and the WTO letting in China in 2001, which just had a huge impact in places like Southwest Ohio, and so dad's company goes bankrupt. His parents' marriage breaks up, which is not unrelated to that, and Todd is basically sort of cast on his own in his late teens, and goes through over the next decade or so, an extraordinary succession of low-wage jobs. Like, I list them all in the book. There's about 15 of them. I mean, he's fast food, working at the register at the AutoZone, Home Depot, trying to sell vacuum cleaners, where you to old ladies, door to door, and then finally ends up around right when I met him, he was making cardboard boxes, and which is a big business now in Dayton, because Dayton has become essentially is no longer an innovation town, manufacturing innovation town. It's now a logistics town. So all sorts of trucking and packaging and cardboard box making and all moving stuff that's been made elsewhere. And he, while this is all happening, while he's going through this whole string of low-wage jobs, his family life is in constant strain and disarray. He has a longtime girlfriend with whom he's had 3 children, and they are. He loves his children. He strives constantly to be a good father, but there's just constant turmoil in their life, which includes, unfortunately, domestic violence, mostly, though not entirely, from him, and which then leads to constant stays in jail, and back and forth through cycling in and out of jail, in and out of court, and back and sometimes together with his girlfriend, sometimes apart, and to the point where it's all such turmoil and such a constant downward spiral and downward mobility that, which also, of course, not surprisingly, includes some drug issues, this is, during a time when Southwest Ohio is just saturated in the opioid epidemic. But it gets so bad by the time that I met them in early 2017, they were actually living in a homeless shelter. They were living in a homeless shelter in Dayton, even though he was working. And it was just sort of this end of the road for all these different sort of factors that have brought them there. They weren't actually even living together in the shelter because there was a family shelter, but he was not allowed to be with them at the family shelter because men were not allowed in the family shelter. And so he was in a separate men's shelter, about, 15-minute drive away, but he would occasionally sort of manage to slip into the family shelter to visit with them. But that's where I met him. And to see this, to me, it was such a strong visceral example of this sort of the real life human impacts of that that new kind of work, that downward mobility that comes with it in places like that. He's a really remarkable young man. He believes so hard in working hard and trying to provide for his family, but it has just come so hard for him.
Yeah. Again, thinking about steel and other heavy industrial jobs that did provide good living wages. They did, but they were also extremely dangerous and led to a variety of health problems for people later in life. While there's been a lot of journalism highlighting the dangerous nature of Amazon warehouse jobs, I think in a lot of ways the manufacturing jobs were much more dangerous. So thinking about that, I mean, should we be mourning the loss of these heavy manufacturing jobs? Was this trade-off okay, or should we be more forward-looking and not trying to reach back to our sort of manufacturing past?
One of the things that sort of knocked me out the most in my reporting and research for the book was discovering just how dangerous that work was at Beth Steel. I read, some of the great books that have been written on Sparrows Point, Beth Steel in Baltimore, and then I also did a lot of research at the Enoch Pratt and at the library here, going through all the clips, and just you're overwhelmed by just how intense and often dangerous the work was. And the worker that I focus on, former Beth Steel worker who spent several decades there and then went on to work at an Amazon warehouse in the exact same piece of land that after Beth Steel left Sparrows Point, had also had himself experienced several major injuries, including one that finally tilted him toward leaving the steel plant in his 60s. And so I think it's very important that we do not glorify that work or over idealize it. And there's also, of course, the whole other aspect of massive sort of downside of that whole heavy industry, which was the pollution, just incredible pollution that was spewing out of a place like Sparrows Point. That said, I do think that there has been something lost, and what's been lost for someone like Bill Bodani, that former steel worker who went to work at Amazon, is a sense of purpose and meaning and dignity and fellowship on the job. When you hear someone like Bill talk about his years at Beth Steel, and then all these other guys who, black and white, who you hear, still here in Baltimore, you hear them on the radio sometimes. There was a good recent podcast on WYPR here in Baltimore on Sparrows Point, and you hear those former workers talk, and there's such pride in their recollections and feeling of meaning that they were making something. They were good at their job. Their work had purpose. They were making steel that was going into bridges and buildings and tunnels and making our country run. And one of the things that Bill Bodani found so hard about going to the Amazon warehouse was not just the fact that he was making less than half as much money at that job as he was making steel on the exact same piece of land. It was not just that he didn't have enough time to go to the bathroom and sometimes had to sneak behind his forklift, to take a leak. But it was this, above all, this feeling of just a complete loss of purpose and camaraderie of the sort that he had in that steelwork. And I don't know what there's a whole other debate to be had about how much hope we can even have for somehow bringing back that kind of work or reshoring it somehow. And of course, because today you have the added element that automation, even if you were to bring back a lot of the work, so much more of it has become automated. But I do think that one has to reckon with the fact that there has been something lost, that even though the Amazon work is no question less dangerous than the work at the steel mill, that there was something larger that work provided that it's going to be hard to recapture in the robot warehouse.
Yeah. Listening to that podcast, I was struck not only by the camaraderie and sense of community, but there was also skill building that was happening. Exactly. They were learning from each other. I mean, it was I had no idea. But ending our conversation today, I want to think about looking forward. I think we're at a point where there's a growing acceptance in the U.S. that the concentration of wealth and economic growth in a few cities has been, largely to the detriment of the rest of the U.S. And again, thinking about, what might help turn the tide here, a lot of economists are starting to embrace place-based policies that would help generate economic growth in cities that have lagged behind. And I think you've seen a little bit of this in some of Biden's proposals as well. So again, thinking about how we can get ourselves out of this bad equilibrium that we find ourselves in, as you think about this, what combination of place-based policies or as you said, sort of antitrust legislation to break up big companies? I mean, how do we think about this going forward?
I've been quite persuaded by the sort of package put forward by, there's a young sociologist by the name of Robert Manduca, who has been really good at first of all, at linking the antitrust issue to regional inequality and just showing how much of a difference you could start to make in dispersing growth to cross left behind cities through antitrust, that they're just how closely the concentration of wealth in certain places is linked with the concentration of our economy and a handful of big companies, not just in tech, but especially in tech. And that's such a big part of why, a place like a St. Louis, has just fallen behind as you had all this consolidation in all these different sectors that ended up making a city like that, or like Baltimore, essentially a branch town. And but Robert also has a whole other menu of things that his basic argument, and I'm persuaded by this, is that place-based, that attempts to really target growth in certain places have a mixed record. And you're seeing it again now with the opportunity zones, right? There was just in the paper this morning, I saw, in the Financial Times, I think it was, another story about just how mixed the record for Trump's opportunity zones it's been. And that's not to say that we can't keep, trying on that front. But Robert's argument is that the better approach is broad-based approaches that are sort of nationwide in scope, general in scope, but are inevitably going to have the biggest impact in the places that need the most. So big infrastructure spending, yes. Trade policy, rethinking trade policy, yes. Things that if you that there's a natural, that if you're even if it seems like it's nationwide and broad-based in scope, that it will hopefully still have, if you're trying to address national needs that somehow you actually end up addressing the needs most in the neediest places, in a sense. So, or social, also not just infrastructure spending, but general sort of social welfare spending, broadly defined, will inevitably end up in the sense, in the way that the New Deal did, in a way that will inevitably end up helping most in the places that need it most, that it kind of flows most to the neediest places. So without being explicitly place-based. So I think, so I find that persuasive, but at the end of the day, I do think it has to start with the antitrust and with that dispersal of that regional dispersal is so tied to dispersal in these markets. And I think at bottom, the book is not an argument book. Fulfillment's not an argument book. It's not a thesis book. It's not a policy solutions book. But if there's one thing I think it does leave one with, is the sense that the best place to start with trying to address regional equality is through breaking up these giants, or at least trying to rein them in.
Well, thanks for taking the time to talk with me today. Really enjoyed our conversation and enjoyed reading your book as well.
Thank you. It's great.